In last week's VAD, we we introduced ourselves to the second way that we acquire habits. Okay, if the first and primary way was through repetition of action and behavior and actually doing a pattern over and over and over and developing a habit, so the second way was through watching. Okay, and we described how through watching alone, okay, we're capable of connecting neurons, developing habits, and actually hardwiring our brain, l'tov l'ra, both whether it's being able to watch role models, learn from role models, be able to, it doesn't even just have to be watching live role models, it can be reading stories and situations where we walk through situations, and that itself can help develop certain habits. Okay, it points us to a chazal where Chazal, or not necessarily a Chazal, but a Drush and a Chazal. We know that Chazal, when they're dorish the question by Sota of the connection between Sota and Nazir, so we know the famous Chazal, which says, and I would think this has come up certainly in Vad before, not in this Vad, but in other contexts before, or in Shmuz before, that the Kol Haroe Sota B'Kilkulo Yazir Atzmo Min Hayayin. Okay, which the most simple sense, though anyone who sees a sota in her low point, okay, shall separate himself, so abstain himself from yain, shall take upon himself a certain nazirus. Okay, the most simple understanding and the most basic understanding is that we are inspired. We learn lessons from other people's mistakes, unfortunately. We must be able to, when we see how someone else has fallen from a lack of self-control, then we now are inspired by that to make sure to grow our self-control. But there's another way to understand that, okay? And the other way to understand that, another drush from the Bali Musar, is not as an inspiration, okay? But Kol Haroe Sota B'Kilkula, and we're referring there to the Kohanim in the Beis Hamikdash, someone who sees a sota in a compromising position, in a situation where she has fallen, they now have been affected. Okay, they have now been exposed. Okay, they should be exposed. It's their mitzvah to get involved, and it's their chiyuv to get involved. But despite the fact that they're doing something which is good in the big picture, but they're still being exposed. And when they get exposed, you now have a demand. There's now a demand. Yazir atzmo min hayayin. You must now compensate. Okay, if you've now seen a pattern of lack of self-control and running after taiva, you now must compensate for what has now happened from you seeing that, which is that you must now yazir atzmina min hayayin, you must strengthen yourself in the area of self-control. Okay, so that's what we spoke about last week. Okay, the third piece of the puzzle, if there was behavior actually practicing and repeating, and the second was by watching, observational conditioning. The third is going to be a bigger chiddush, and the third is going to be a model which we talk about in terms of visualization. Okay, we know in Chazal, we'll start with the science. Okay, we know, and we've seen that both specifically when it's tested in sports, okay, or in athletics, okay, that the difference is someone who has repeated and started to repeat an action, but is also added to that time when they have visualized the process, and they've seen it, not that they've watched someone else, but they've closed their eyes and they've imagined the entire process. That itself is effective in creating a habit. It's not clear that it's necessarily effective when you haven't seen it at all, or you haven't practiced it at all. But if you've seen it and practiced it, then being able to visualize and imagine also creates and affects this process. We see that what happens in the brain, okay, when someone is actually playing out a certain activity, is the same exact thing. When we measure the brain activity, it's the same exact activity in the same place and the same brain activity which is happening when someone is imagining the same exact process. Okay, now let's keep in mind the fact that because of the fact we're talking about a pattern, it doesn't just mean that you're imagining the end, you're imagining winning, you're imagining this. It means that because we said a cue is very local to a specific situation, a specific person, a specific place, a specific set, so it means that the imagination has to be completely, you have to go piece by piece, imagining where you are, imagining the setting, imagining the people, imagining walking into the setting, and then playing out each stage of the setting. And if you're able to do that effectively, that itself can help create and affect and strengthen those neural connections. Okay, this gives us a little bit of an idea of what Chazal are talking about. We know the famous Chazal in Yoma, which Nefesh Chaim talks about, where we say, when Chazal say that kashe here hure avera, okay, meha maaseh avera. Okay, it doesn't mean that it's always more chamer. It certainly doesn't mean that you get a greater punishment for the thought and thinking out an avera, or for planning of avera, than actually doing an avera. Okay, in one explanation of that Chazal is that simply that thought is at the highest level of the person, meaning it's pogeya, it hurts a more central aspect of what makes a person a person. Okay, but in our discussion here, there's another aspect. Okay, that not just doing an avera ingrains an avera in us, but also imagining and walking through an avera and Khalila planning an avera also has an effect and is kashe aleinu. Okay, we could say just as much. Okay, but again, for our purposes, it's not really a question of measuring which is more, because there's advantages to each. Okay, even if there's a stronger effect of the action, you don't get to always conjure up and initiate when that action's going to happen. Okay, and we're not just talking about a behavior, it can also be a feeling. If we want to react in a certain way and not angrily, so we walk ourselves into that situation, it means you have to push everything else away. We'll work on the exercises another time. But being able to push everything else out, you walk into that scenario which normally angers us, and we picture ourselves walking through the process which we would like to act out. Okay, first we have to be able to define ourselves how we would like to react. But then actually walking through that entire reaction, walking through how we feel, walking through how we respond, walking through how we act. Okay? The advantage of this piece of the puzzle, okay, all three are going to come into play. Behavior, watching, and imagining, and all have their own advantages. The advantage of imagination is that it's totally in your hands. Okay, you can set yourself aside and you can repeat over something and reimagine something 10 times a day, 15 times a day. Okay, the chisaron, what's missing from the level of imagination, is that you might not realize what all the pieces are of the surroundings and the scenario, which when you're in it, they initiate themselves. But when you have to imagine it, you have to create the whole scenario. You have to realize, oh, maybe it's a function of where I am. And you have to take yourself back to the same place, in the same person, in the same scenario, and the same case. Okay? So there's more work to be involved and pressuration involved in imagination, but that's an important key. Okay, so we're starting to see what some of the ingredients and elements are going to be in order to start resetting, or at least not resetting, in order to create a habit, and we'll talk about what's necessary as we go further. This is really closing up the introduction to the cue and elements of a cue, okay, and how that starts to form. We're going to walk now, next time, into what we mean by responses, what type of responses. I look forward to